Hello, all. Thank you for sticking with me. I haven't been doing too many videos because, I like talking to the camera, I like talking to you, but the time consuming part is the editing. And, as I've said before, when you have two boys and you're married and you have to help your wife with the two boys, or you have to watch the two boys, just having to be a father, it's really hard. But I did a few where I went to my camera phone and was talking, and I'm going to do that here. So if you don't mind having a fancy intro and me just talking with no cuts, and I could upload directly from my camera phone, hopefully that will be okay, and everything will be fine. Because that way I'll be able to do a few and stay up to date and get some up either on a daily or weekly basis, because it's very easy to sit here and talk to you directly on the camera. Kind of what I want to talk about today is I want to kind of tie in a thing that I started last year, Film Corner, with the various ramblings I was doing on the Beatles. And kind of I want to talk about the Beatles movies in general, but also about certain things that could have been with their film career. And I specifically want to talk about it today because I'm excited for the Ron Howard documentary. I know people on the Fab Four Free for All Facebook page have already been nitpicking about it just based on the trailer. And the one thing that I've learned being a film goer is that you really can't judge things based on a trailer. Trailers are cut a certain way. Sometimes the film is not even completed when the trailer is completed. You have a deadline, you have to get a trailer into the theater or on YouTube by a certain date. And, they're still cutting the movie. They're still editing it. There's a couple of things that I am concerned about. The main thing is colorizing the JFK footage of their press conference when they first landed JFK. Maybe they did that for the trailer, I don't know. But to me, I'm not in favor of colorizing anything. But I'm like, I want to take a wait and see approach here when the film comes out. I'm excited to be seeing that I'll be seeing a Beatles film in the theater done by a major director that I like, Ron Howard. And I like filmmakers of fiction film that do documentaries as well. Scorsese has done several. Scorsese did the big, epic George Harrison Living in the Material World, but that was shown on cable. It didn't get a theatrical showing. Jonathan Demme, half of his career is documentaries. Spike Lee's got a lot of documentaries. So this is a documentary, The Beatles, done by a major director. Ron Howard's second documentary. So I'm very excited about that. And I'm very excited about a film being added to the Beatles film catalog. This is technically the Beatles' theatrical follow-up to Let It Be, you could say. But bringing that back, first off, kind of not to get too sidetracked here, but if you only know Richard Lester from A Hard Day's Night and Help, you need to check out some of his other movies. Kino Studio Classics, Kino Lorber Studio Classics have just issued a bunch of his movies on Blu-ray. Obviously the most famous for the Beatle fans, How I Won the War, but also the follow-up to Hard Day's Night. If you haven't seen The Knack and How to Get It, you got to see The Knack and How to Get It, starring Michael Crawford. And they also released The Bed-Sitting Room, a strange film he did called Cuba, are his Three Musketeers films on the way. I certainly hope so. But the Beatles had success with A Hard Day's Night and Help. I don't think I need to talk about A Hard Day's Night and Help. I want to mention a couple of things that could have been. There were a lot of films that were talked about in circles that the Beatles were going to do or could have done. Some of them are myths. I really haven't found any sort of confirmation about the Beatles doing Lord of the Rings. I don't know how they could have done it. I really honestly don't. Supposedly that was in the works. Supposedly the rumor was John asked Stanley Kubrick to direct. I don't know how reliable that is. But one that came close was A Talent for Loving, which would have been a Western based on the Richard Condon novel. But one that was very, very, very close to being done was a script called Up Against It by British writer Joe Orton. And Lester was going to direct it. If you read the script, and the script has been published, they even turned it into a stage musical with music written by Todd Rundgren, actually, in the style of the Beatles. It's I really can't even describe the plot of it. They even turned it into a radio play, and it's out there on YouTube. It's pretty bizarre, the story. It's darkly comic. Definitely not A Hard Day's Night. Definitely not Help. This is sex, political assassination, sexual identity things going on. It's really a interesting film. And when I read the script many years ago, I was like, this would have been interesting. This would have been very interesting to do. Paul McCartney, in a book that I read, said that, that they didn't do the film because, the characters were gay. He's like, I'm not being homophobic. They were gay. We were not gay. But the Beatles decided not to do it, and I think it was a mistake, because I think it could have brought them to another level. I mean, people have this vision of the Beatles, them being this squeaky clean mop tops, even during the whole psychedelic era. And people don't realize how down, dirty, and raw they were. They were down and dirty and raw before the Stones were. I mean, God bless the Stones. I'm a Stones fan, don't get me wrong. But there's these myths that have been put up over the years by people who don't know anything. The Stones were down and dirty and the Beatles were squeaky clean. Well, that was a marketing tool on both of their employees. I think the Up Against It script would have shattered a lot of those myths, especially the final scene, where it was supposed to be all four Beatles involved in an orgy with girls. From what I read, from things that I've read, and there's a little article on it on Wikipedia, so definitely look it up. One of the characters was supposed to assassinate a president of some country, but the Beatles decided not to do it. So when they decided not to do it, Joe Orton combined the George and Ringo characters into another character, and Dick Lester was going to do it with Ian McKellen and Mick Jagger. And the story goes, now, there's an interview with Dick Lester out there on YouTube, recently actually, done with BFI, the British Film Institute, where he called it a light musical comedy. He didn't mention Up Against It, but he did say Joe Orton, so I knew exactly what he was talking about. I wouldn't call this a light musical comedy unless they were going to make it lighter, but Joe Orton was killed by his partner, so they never made it in any shape or form. The next day they were supposed to have a production meeting with Joe Orton and everybody, and it got canceled, and that's when Lester decided to direct at the 11th hour The Bed-Sitting Room, which is probably the most bizarre film Dick Lester ever did. But you think about what the Beatles did after Help, Magical Mystery Tour. If we don't count Yellow Submarine, which I do, but I mean, Magical Mystery Tour, where it was like, we don't need a director, we don't need a screenwriter, we'll do it ourselves. And I sort of have a love-hate thing with Magical Mystery Tour. I mean, like I say, I could defend it on the fact that you wouldn't have Monty Python's Flying Circus and the format of that show if it wasn't for Magical Mystery Tour. And those psychedelic musical interludes that don't have anything to do with the plot of the thing. But at the same time, it can be difficult to watch. Now, granted, it's not as difficult as Jean-Luc Godard's film of Sympathy for the Devil, which I don't even think the Stones like to acknowledge. The great thing about that film is you see the Stones in the studio working on Sympathy for the Devil, but the other interludes Godard put in there that have to do with political revolution and whatever, it's really a jumbled mess as well. But and then of course Let It Be, which was edited into a feature-length documentary because the Beatles owed United Artists one more movie. They had a 3-picture deal, and Yellow Submarine was not going to cut it. I think Up Against It was an extreme missed opportunity on the Beatles' part. And when I sit there and think about it, I'm like, I think the Beatles, could have had a great film career. They were definitely onto a better start than Elvis was, and that's a whole other story altogether. I could do a whole video on Elvis films, pre-Army and then after Army. That's a story right there in itself. But I think sometimes the Beatles did need the grown-up in the room. And I really do think that a couple of missed opportunities. A Talent for Loving, I don't know too much about it. I never read the book. But it would have been interesting for them to do something along those lines of a Western. And of course, Up Against It would have been very good. And I really think with their film career, we could have had a lot more. We probably could have had another classic, or at least a film that we'd still be talking about nowadays outside of the Beatles circles. So that's my take on that. And I hope you enjoyed this. And thank you for sticking with me. 12 minutes. Good job. Bye-bye.